Is there such a thing as criminal science communication? The marketing department at Colossal Biosciences has volunteered as a test case after wildly exaggerating the results from an internal interdisciplinary research group. We recently covered the alleged woolly mammice from Colossal Biosciences, which used a very similar multiplex gene editing approach to edit genes, mostly with known or highly predictable phenotype. That is, they had tons of previously published studies to rely on to know what kind of traits would result from editing those genes in a mouse. A few weeks later, they did roughly the same approach, but instead of lab mice and mammoth phenotype, it's wolves and direwolves, and those are close enough that the press release is far bolder. We've de-extincted the direwolf. Well-deserved pushback ensues across the internet. No, obviously we have not done that. A lot of folks have talked about this, but just to get us all on the same page, here's what Colossal Biosciences did. They collaborated with other research groups to sequence 2 novel direwolf genomes that added much more coverage than we had previously. We didn't really have great direwolf reference genomes the way we had mammoth genomes, so first they needed better genetic information about the direwolf to compare to other canids. They used that and other information to identify a handful of genes in existing gray wolves that, if edited, would make the resultant wolf appear slightly more similar to our archaeological and genomic evidence of a direwolf. Some of those are the genes identified in the first step from the direwolf genome. Some of them are different genes that kinda sorta do a similar thing, much like they did with the woolly mice. Then, they took circulating endothelial progenitor cells, the cells in your bloodstream that repair and replace your blood vessels when you get a cut or something, and turned those back into stem cells. They edit the DNA in the nucleus of that cell, all the edits at once, the DNA doesn't get damaged and repaired successively a bunch of times. Cells hate that. Then, they put the edited wolf nucleus into a wolf egg cell that had its nucleus taken out. This is classic Dolly-style cloning procedure. They implant that egg into a surrogate dog, and in about October 2024, there were born a few gene-edited clones of the wolf whose progenitor cells we took. Look, by now, I've already gotten the Colossal Biosciences skepticism out of my system with the woolly mice. We know their biotechnology stack is nowhere near what would be required for the de-extinction claim. It's criminal science communication. This awful marketing strategy. These poor scientists. I'm going to ignore the marketing team's claims because unlike the woolly mouse story, which published press release and preprint simultaneously, this time the marketing team got out ahead of the preprint publication from the scientific team, which they put out on bioRxiv on Friday, April 11th, well after a zillion, "Hey, this isn't a direwolf," articles and videos, because, I mean, no, obviously we have not done that. In fact, I'm going to tell you about an unrelated scientific study from 2019, and I think it'll say everything I need to say about whether making 20 edits to 14 or 15 genes is sufficient to make any kind of claim about a species, de-extinct or not. The article in Nature Communications performed whole genome sequencing of 238 dogs and identified 76.8 million biallelic variants. Those are sites on the genome where you have either one version of the genes or another. Those dogs are all the same species. Colossal Biosciences made 20 edits to like 14 or 15 genes. Obviously, that's still the same species. If you want to hear more about how this has nothing to do with new species or de-extincting direwolves, there's tons of content out there to that effect already, because the marketing department is committing criminal science communication. These poor scientists. The direwolf preprint isn't even on the scientific papers section of the company website. You can see the woolly mice paper here, but most of the authors on the papers in this section do not list affiliation with Colossal Biosciences in those publications. These seem to be papers that are simply related to the topic. It's incredibly sad, because actually, scientists at Colossal Biosciences have published several preprints that, if they are anywhere on Colossal Biosciences' website, are wildly well hidden. The direwolf manuscript published on April 11th? Yeah, I tripped over that manuscript in a search engine while looking for direwolf reference genome information. I found more of the preprints by looking up the publication records of the individual scientists who are employed at Colossal Biosciences, though I couldn't find peer-reviewed, published versions of those preprints, even ones that were up to a year old. They may exist, those publications may still be in process, but for some reason, Colossal Biosciences isn't plastering them all over their website. And that's truly unfortunate, because it's like a parent who refuses to put your school drawings on the refrigerator. Colossal Biosciences employs dozens of scientists, engineers, and technicians across a range of fields who in turn collaborate with academics and indigenous councils and wildlife research institutes all over the world. Every single researcher I looked up who works there has strong scientific training and a publication record full of interesting research. From their chief science officer, who specializes in conservation genomics, to the director of species restoration, who's working alongside one of their senior embryologists and a research team at University of Melbourne to improve the laboratory model for studying marsupials. Because, like, all our typical mammalian lab animals are placental mammals, and we want to be able to study things like marsupial reproductive biology in the lab. By the way, I wish I had found that on Colossal Biosciences' website, but I didn't. I only found more news articles about their press releases. So with all this range of fields, you have a bunch of well-trained scientists doing cool, weird stuff, like trying to refine the lab model to study marsupial biology. They've also got another team that works on stem cell biology in organisms we don't typically study in labs, like the rhinoceros. What works for mouse stem cells may be different than what works for a rhino or an elephant, so it's actually not trivial to go from multiplex gene editing on a lab mouse to make it woolly, to using those same techniques on an animal we don't study in the lab nearly as often, an elephant. There's also an entire team that's in charge of animal handling. You can actually read the 161-page manual that the team uses to take care of their gene-edited wolf pups and their dog surrogates, and how these people take notes on the animal's behavior and growth. For some reason, Colossal Biosciences makes that much easier to find than their science. It outlines all their employee safety procedures when working with these non-domesticated animals, a bunch of requirements for their habitats to reduce animal stress. Like, you should wipe down hard surfaces in their habitat with alcohol to prevent microbial growth, but also the elimination of scents can also stress out an animal, especially canids, so they're warned to keep an eye out for that as well. These standard procedures are derived from guidelines and information from the Association for Zoos and Aquariums and follow protocols from 10 different high-quality facilities like San Diego's. The details of canid care and behavior have probably a couple hundred reference sources in the bibliography of that document. What I'm getting at is, this is much more conscientious, thoughtful work than you'd expect from a company whose business team and marketing department grossly mischaracterized their colleagues' work in public. So the preprint that I found comes from a division I haven't talked about yet, the computation biology team. When I talked about the step-by-step process to making this edited wolf, the first thing I mentioned was that they sequenced some new direwolf genetic material and compared that to other canid genomes. That's the part this team that published is working on. So this paper isn't about the genetic engineering or anything. That's a whole different team, and if the genetic engineering team for the wolves has a preprint of their own, once again, it's well hidden. But With this new genetic data, the bioinformatics team takes another run at the phylogenetic tree of direwolves. Scientists have been trying to figure out for a while how direwolves fit into the canid family tree, but it's hard when you've got a lot of genetic information missing from your samples, so whenever you get new samples and better coverage, you're going to try again and see what results you get with the new data, or using new analytical methods to try to solve the problem from another angle. Like previous studies, they find that the direwolf lineage splits into its own thing before jackals and wolf lineages split. The press and science communication around this press release also made a point to note that Colossal Biosciences found higher similarity between the genetic sequences of direwolves and the wolf lineages than they did between direwolves and jackals, and critics pointed out that the finding was at odds with a 2021 Nature paper. Yes, the Colossal Biosciences preprint did find very slightly higher sequence similarity between gray wolves and direwolves than between gray wolves and jackals. 99.94 versus 99.91, both of which are way less divergence than expected. I'm not reading too terribly much into it personally, especially since the overall genetic distance was roughly the same by other analyses. Besides, look at the 2021 paper and the Colossal Biosciences preprint side by side. At the end of the day, this is the same tree. You can see the little alternative trees on the left side of each figure where they test which split best fit the data. They both find that the most likely thing is that direwolves split off, then jackals and wolves, and it's less likely that jackals diverge than wolves and direwolves together, and it's least likely that wolves diverged than direwolves and jackals. So everybody's agreeing with each other loudly and contentiously, which is exactly what you would expect when Colossal Biosciences put out the press release a week ahead of this scientific manuscript. So a bunch of journalists went to scientists for comment, and those scientists had to be like, well, that claim doesn't match the data we've seen, and we can't see Colossal Biosciences data. And they were justifiably critical of claims they couldn't verify. Which is exactly why you don't put out your press release before your data. See, now all the methods and analysis are in the preprint, and the sequencing data sessions are publicly available, but it's too late. These poor scientists. When you read the manuscript, it's like any other bioinformatics paper. It's very careful not to make overclaims, to identify all the potential limitations in their study, and to lay out all the additional analyses they did to try to compensate for the potential limitations that could be compensated for, and to be honest about the ones they can't. It's a normal scientific paper. I'm not gonna lie, I found it a little dense and unpleasant to read. I would have expected better storytelling from a paper with George R.R. Martin among the authors. Yes, that George R.R. Martin. You know, because direwolves. He, along with every author on this paper, is credited with writing, reviewing, and editing. For the record, giving authorship to someone who didn't meaningfully contribute is called gift authorship. And a study in the journal Accountability in Research says it is perceived to be, quote, the most prevalent research fraud in the United States. So I hope for ethics' sake that George R.R. Martin was out there doing some cool bioinformatics. But other than a fantasy novelist listed among the paper's authors, this is the kind of manuscript no one would ever bat an eye at if it hadn't been deliberately clickbaited to its detriment. In fact, when you zoom out, the whole project is like that. They did multiplex gene editing on a non-model organism, the wolf, based in part, though not entirely, on novel bioinformatic analysis that we see in this paper. Had no one said de-extincting the direwolf, that'd be perfectly lovely niche science. Might get some criticism in peer review, there might be some back and forth in letters to the editor, but that's what science is like when it works. And that's what I want for the researchers at Colossal Biosciences. They're highly trained professionals working on weird little projects, and they should be able to research marsupial biology and wolf stem cells and ancient genetic analysis that advances things incrementally, because that's science for you. They deserve better than Colossal Biosciences hiding their preprints away rather than proudly displaying them on the proverbial refrigerator. And these researchers should be able to do their work without all this harmful noise from the marketing department that throws them under the bus. That's not to say that the scientists at Colossal Biosciences are all perfect angels who have never done a wrong thing in their life and never contributed to this media storm. Chief Science Officer Beth Shapiro told Wired magazine, quote, "If it looks like a direwolf and acts like a direwolf, I'm gonna call it a direwolf, and as we probably understand right now, that's just a silly thing to say about the project at this stage. Dr. Shapiro knows better. She's on that 2021 Nature paper about the direwolves, and she's senior author of this preprint." I'm just glad her scientific work represents her better than her public statements about that work. Because the thing is, there are consequences for this kind of criminal science communication. The Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Interior has used it as ammunition against the Endangered Species Act in a public statement because, hey, we're just gonna de-extinct species, no big deal. That's such a horrible takeaway about the work from a research group that's using biotechnology for conservation purposes. And it's yet another reason why the first and foremost duty of science should always be to the truth. So after all that, what do we take away from this? Well, one, in case you haven't guessed, is that I think the Colossal Biosciences business team should be put in corporate timeout. Science communication constantly suffers from overexcited university news staff misrepresenting their faculty's findings, but those communication issues rarely rise to this level of scientific snafu, and I don't think that's a coincidence. The financial pressures of being a biotech startup that has to turn lovely, weird, niche science into some kind of profit probably played a role in this mess, and in the woolly mice who came before. Lovely, weird, niche science thrives with public funding, and what we're seeing here is that isn't just good for science, it keeps perverse incentives out of the science communication as well. Do I want to de-extinct species? Irrelevant. That isn't what happened here. It's nowhere near what they're doing, even though their projects are nominally aimed at that goal. But aiming at that goal has produced some fun, interesting studies along the way. Kind of like how NASA's research for the space race resulted in tons of cool materials and tools we use for all kinds of stuff today. It's a project that shouldn't be done just for profit, but for the love of the game. Love that these researchers clearly, sincerely feel. Go on, you little weirdos. Enjoy your gene edits and your marsupial biology. Let me know if you ever lock in that direwolf family tree.